All right, good evening, everyone. I'm going to work here on a Cold War foreign policy video from after World War II, 1945, until we're going to get up to 1961 and Eisenhower's farewell address. First, I do want to say that I have borrowed, with permission, most of this PowerPoint from a phenomenal teacher up in Westchester County. Ms. Poger is she runs a website, PowerPoint Palooza, so I just want to give credit for that because I was at the basketball game this afternoon. Okay, so here we go. The Cold War is an ideological struggle. It is between the Soviet Union and the United States, and this takes place following World War II, and it goes all the way to 1991. Some people, please keep in mind, do believe that our decision to drop the second atomic bomb on Japan was not only to get the Japanese to surrender, but also to send a message to the Russians that we meant business. Now, on this slide here, you can see that the Soviet Union is going to have these Eastern Bloc countries, countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, which I'll get to, Romania, Bulgaria. These are all countries that were referred to as satellite nations for the Soviet Union during the communism versus United States conflict. And sometimes kids don't fully understand. The economic systems are capitalism for the United States, communism for the Soviet Union. But it's not a war that we fought directly on the battlefield. It's much more of an ideological struggle, and there are going to be proxy wars that take place all throughout the world. Some of the concerns we have are clearly espionage. They had the KGB, the United States had the CIA. There's a tremendous arms race between the two countries, building up our weapons. And there's going to be different world organizations or alliances that take place, one being NATO, Warsaw Pact. But I'll get to all of that as these slides go on. All right, so first, remember that after World War II, the United Nations was created as an organization to maintain world peace. Some of you Munners might, or former Munners, I know we have some Munner dropouts as well in the audience, might be aware that the temporary first headquarters for the United Nations was actually in Lake Success, our very own, not really ours, but next door to us, Lake Success, until the permanent headquarters were finished in New York City. Okay, so one of the first issues that they had to deal with following the conclusion of World War II is the city of Berlin. Now, Germany was going to be divided between East Germany and West Germany. So you have United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And they each had a zone in Germany. The U.S., Great Britain, and France combined theirs, whereas the Russians, you can see here, are in pink. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the geography. I can certainly tell you when I was in high school, I did not know this. We divided up East Germany and West Germany, but we also divided up Berlin. So when I was in high school, I thought Berlin was actually on the border, and I shouldn't have moved that. And I'm sure some of you are probably laughing at me, but again, you know, I like to admit when I don't know everything. So Berlin's not. Berlin is completely inside of East Germany, and I'm having some difficulty here. So when they divided up Berlin, the Soviets, the problem I'm having is I can't get the pen to write, the Soviets set up a blockade around West Berlin to try to cut it off. Let's see if this works. Okay, good. So this is the Berlin blockade. And I just wrote outside of the margins. Now, the Allies had a decision to make. They don't want to have to give up the western part of Berlin, so they go in with an airlift. And this is one of the greatest humanitarian relief efforts that the world has ever seen. And it's called Operation Vittles, and they just keep dropping in supplies to the people in West Berlin. So they were saved, and Berlin will remain a divided city until 1989. Now, some of you are wondering, well, isn't there a wall that was built? Just, if you're interested, just keep in mind that the Berlin Wall was not finished until 1961. So the wall goes from 61 to 89. So that's one of the first early conflicts that we have. And you Euro people probably know about Winston Churchill, who gave the famous Iron Curtain speech. He actually gave that speech in Missouri about how the world was being divided up between the communist eastern part of Europe and the free democratic western part. And as a side note, there is a play about Winston Churchill that I think is getting good reviews. I know that's not American history, but I don't know, I'm contemplating if talk to Ms. Blanc and see if we want to get that as a post-AP potential field trip. All right, the name that I would love for you all to know for the Cold War is George Kennan. And why do I want you to know George Kennan? Well, he was in the Truman administration. I probably should have went over the presidents, but in the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration, he's going to be the expert on Soviet affairs, working in the State Department. Now, he comes up with a policy called containment. And his belief is that the United States should try to stop the spread of communism. And it's very interesting because you are probably familiar with wars that we fought in Korea and Vietnam, among other smaller conflicts. Later on, George Kennan wrote articles saying that he didn't necessarily mean we should stop the spread of communism through warfare. He felt that it really should have been more economic in nature. I will actually post an article later in the week from George Kennan, his beliefs, and it will not be with 7 chapters long. But containment is critical to the U.S. foreign policy and for you understanding U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War conflict. And the best examples of that, as you can see, nothing on this slide, is our first policy in 1947, which will be the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine is when we provide aid, economic aid, to Greece and Turkey. And the goal here was to stabilize them financially. Communist leaders have an easier time taking over when the economy is struggling within the country. I know I have some audience members here thinking that I'm, fully bad-mouthing communism, but you can save that for the class. There was plenty of time for discussion. So we were trying to stabilize Greece and Turkey financially, so the Truman Doctrine, giving them that money, was on the premise that they would not turn communist. Because it worked in both of those countries, the U.S. decided to expand the program. And now, I believe it's 1947 also, maybe 48, is our Secretary of State, George Marshall, comes up with the Marshall Plan, also called the European Economic Recovery Plan. And this was a package of $12 billion in aid to Western European nations on the same premise: do not turn communist. So, between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, it is clear that the United States is committed to stopping the spread of communism. All right. So next, this is a map of Europe following World War II. And the two organizations that are going to form, one is going to be called NATO, and that's the alliance for the United States. So if you're on the side of the U.S., and you join NATO, you are committed to defending the democratic western part. So you'll see West Germany, Belgium, France, Netherlands, UK, Portugal, Italy, Greece and Turkey, because of the Truman Doctrine. Those countries are all part of NATO, which forms in 1949. Now, the Soviet Union develops its own alliance, and that'll be called the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact, 1955, is all those Soviet satellite countries that I was referring to earlier. So you have Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria. You get the point. This alliance system is going to continue for several decades, and NATO is still around today. All right, just to give you a little image of our defense spending, you can see how the budget skyrocketed following World War II, 1948 to 1952. And one of the things we were hoping to do is to outspend the Soviet Union so that we could continue to take care of our populace, whereas their people would be economically disadvantaged. Some people make the argument that much later, of course, is one of the reasons why we were able to win this war. All right, and at this point I'm realizing I apologize, I'm missing a slide here, but just be aware, I can do it on this slide, just be aware before we get to the Korean War, please be aware that in 1949, a significant event occurred, and that is the fall of China to communism. So in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fell to Mao Zedong and the communists. And the fall of China, this is still under Truman, didn't bode well for the support or lack thereof that he was receiving, since we were trying to maintain this containment policy. So as far as this Korean War, 1950 to 1953, here's how this all unfolds. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, and the communists were on the northern side, bordered with China, whereas the non-communists are from the south. Now, on June of 1950, the North Korean army, surprisingly, or at least that's what I've read, invaded South Korea. Did the Soviets encourage this? Did they antagonize this issue? That's to be debated. Nevertheless, we are stuck with the possibility of communism continuing to expand. Now, this is not a U.S. declared war. What will happen is we will go to the United Nations and ask for the UN to issue a police action and allow the United Nations, of course the troops would be largely under the command of the United States, but have the United Nations forces take this on. Again, for some of you former or current Munners, the United Nations has a Security Council with 5 permanent members out of 15, who those 5 all have veto power. So they could veto anything that the United Nations wants to do. The 5 countries with veto power are the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia, the Soviet Union. And you might be wondering, well, why wouldn't the Soviet Union just boycott this or veto it? They were boycotting the UN at the time because the UN would not recognize the communist government of China. That's how this all got unfolded. So it is President Truman who's in the White House at the time, and the commanding general will be Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur's troops have a very successful campaign pushing the North Koreans first back beyond the 30th parallel, but then really forcing them all the way up to the Chinese border, or very close to it. But in, I think, November, the Chinese were waiting for MacArthur's troops and really pushed them and overwhelmed them all the way back. It was a terrible defeat for the U.S., but under the United Nations auspices. So as a very veteran commanding general, Douglas MacArthur wanted to attack China and probably wanted to use some form of an atomic bomb. But the only person that can make that decision is President Truman. So this becomes known as the Truman-MacArthur controversy, because Truman will not make that decision. He decides to not expand the war into China. And MacArthur was publicly critical of Truman. And when you criticize the president, that will often not go well for you. So Douglas MacArthur was dismissed. So now you have a president who has fired one of our most distinguished military heroes. And when he did return home, most Americans, or I think it was around 70%, actually supported MacArthur over Truman. In class, if you remind me, I can tell you about a similar situation in which under the Obama administration, General Stanley McChrystal criticized Obama in a Rolling Stone magazine article, and I can tell you how that unfolded as well. So anyway, this conflict leads to MacArthur out as general, but the war itself will not end until Eisenhower is in office, and you all know how this all unfolds today, with North Korea still being an issue for the country or for the world. Our fear, by the way, is also this domino theory. We just felt that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow, and that's why we're trying to prevent the spread of communism throughout the world. So now we're up after Truman. We go to Eisenhower, and I apologize, but here's just a list of the various Cold War conflicts and Cold War issues under President Eisenhower. The first one is his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who I believe one of the airports in D.C. is named after him. And he believed that we should be a little bit stronger with a policy called brinksmanship. Let's bring everybody to the brink of nuclear war. Dulles, however, Eisenhower would not obviously follow through with that. Next, there are going to be problems that we have when Eisenhower is president in Africa and Latin America. And I will ask you to read Matt DeNaro's research paper to talk about the U.S. involvement in places like Guatemala during the 1950s and covert operations with the CIA. But I'm going to try to cut this down to 20 minutes. So again, you could ask me that in class. As far as Vietnam, we're going to do the Vietnam War in class as well. But just be aware that when Eisenhower was president in 1954, that's when they divided up Vietnam at the Geneva Conference. And the goal was they divided up at the 17th parallel. And they were going to hold elections eventually, but I'll explain that all in class. The Suez Crisis is something you probably learned last year. This takes place in Egypt. So a refresher for you on the Suez Crisis. In the 1950s, there was an Arab leader in Egypt, Gamal Nasser, and he wanted to build a dam project on the Nile River. The United States would not give him any money to build that, so then Egypt asked the Soviet Union for money and did receive the necessary funds. So that kind of led to, obviously, Egypt going closer to the Soviet Union. But then the Suez Canal, which was British and French owned, part of it went through Egyptian territory. So the Egyptians nationalized it. They took control of their part. Now this upset Britain and France very much. So they decided, along with Israel, to attack Egypt. Again, Britain, France, and Israel attacking Egypt. Notice I did not say the United States. The U.S., under President Eisenhower, was very upset that they were not told about this. And it's just another example of a Cold War conflict that could have escalated out of control. Our response to this, though, was the Eisenhower Doctrine, in which in 1957 we said now that we'll start to give aid to any Middle Eastern country that feels threatened by communism. So it's the same thing as the Truman Doctrine, only instead of it being in Greece and Turkey, it's in the Middle East. As far as the arms race, just be aware that we were building weapons even stronger than the atomic bomb. There was a hydrogen bomb that we built, but then 9 months later, the Soviets also got that hydrogen bomb. So we keep building up our weaponries, and in the end, you'll see the United States winning out. 1956, there's a revolt in Hungary. That's another shout out to my AP Euro people. 1956, somebody made a very funny comment about that in class, but I just can't remember when it was. Very important is Sputnik. This was a Soviet satellite that went into orbit around the Earth, and it was before we were able to do so. This was a national embarrassment for the United States. So how did we respond to it? By putting more money into math and science education, so our students could then build the next Sputnik. This will be the National Education and Defense Act. And it was very successful, as you know, because our math and science education today is number one in the world, at least for some districts. And last for Eisenhower, the U-2 spy plane incident. There was a peace conference being planned between the United States and Soviet Union during Eisenhower's presidency. However, months before this was going to happen, a U.S. plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Now, when the plane was shot down, the United States responded by saying that we were just checking weather patterns. But the Soviets under Khrushchev did not believe us, and this led to a cancellation of the, I think it was the Paris Peace Summit. All right, and then our last thing I find to be the most important of all, and that is Eisenhower's farewell address. So in 1960, Eisenhower leaves office, JFK takes over, and in January of 1961, he gives a speech in which he warns us against the growing military-industrial complex. I hope everybody's listening very carefully. And look at what he says here. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. I will now translate that for you. We should not be going to war simply to build up our... we should not be going to war simply to build up economic benefits for various corporations. We should not be going to war simply to improve our economy. And I'll leave you to decide if we have listened to Eisenhower. Thank you for your patience. Guys, we got about 2 months to go before the exam. Let's make it the best 2 months we've had all year. We'll finish up the Cold War this week, and then we will go back to the beginning. So thank you. I'm going to go now watch the Duke North Carolina basketball game, and I will see everybody on Monday.